I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now. Today on the show, we revisit our conversation with Lindsay Chervinsky on her book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. This book did so much to change the way I thought about Adams' presidency, probably more than any book since Chernow's Grant biography. It's brilliant and well worth re-air on the show. It's Thanksgiving, and Bob and I hope that you guys are going to have a good one with your families. We've taken a little time off, but we're recording new episodes after this week, and look forward to sharing those with you in the future. Happy Thanksgiving. Take care. I'm Ben Sawyer.
I'm Bob Crawford.
And this is
The Road to Now.
It is, and we haven't been together for a while, Bob, so we both want to say it.
We can say it together.
It's awesome that we're back together. We've had a wild summer, both going in different directions. And you just see Bob's face. Yeah, wild summer.
I am ready for not summer.
Well, yeah. Well, Bob maintains a podcast and released an album with the Avett Brothers and has been on tour. It's been a busy summer for him. I've been all over the place. And so now we come back together, and it feels like family because returning to the podcast, our guest today is presidential historian extraordinary Lindsay Chervinsky. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, guys. It's great to see you, and I'm honored to be your first one back together after a while.
Yeah, and Lindsay, you have a new gig.
It has been a busy summer for me, too.
Tell our listeners about they will love to hear about your new job.
Yes. So starting in late July, I became the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library, which is at Mount Vernon. And it is a really crazy full circle moment because I was a fellow there working on my dissertation and have gone back to do a bunch of events and things with them. But to now actually be able to run the library is really fun. And it's a really important moment, both for the library, because it's moving into its second decade. It's only 10 years old. And so thinking about, expansion and what it will be, but also for the nation. We have huge anniversaries coming up and they're important. And I think history and civics are sort of at the front of our political culture as well as our sort of national reckoning. And I'm really excited to be at a place that hopefully should be at the center of that conversation.
And you will do it justice. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You will. And on a lighter note, I don't work there, but I did change my house photos on Zillow to Mount Vernon, photographs of Mount Vernon, just to make sure that anybody who was coming to try to buy my house realized that I was going to be tricksy. So if you go look at my house, it is a mansion, but it's not.
Lindsay, and on this note, I have a point of personal privilege I'd like to take up with someone who works at Mount Vernon and the George Washington Presidential Library. I was there. My wife and I were there probably when it first opened. You said about a decade. It's been around for about a decade. Well, there was, and this may have been Mount Vernon specifically, but there was a board and it had all the towns and cities in the United States named for Washington. But there was one that was not represented. And it was the town of my wife's birth, Little Washington, North Carolina, which was named for General George Washington, not President Washington. So maybe that's something you can just kind of look into, make sure it is represented.
I will make a note.
All right.
I will make a note.
Well, that's great. It's great having you on the show. We've reconciled that. We'll get out of here. That's why.
Important things we have taken care of.
I want to open up now in a way that I laid out with Bob, because we connect the past and the present. And as much as we as scholars go about researching the past with the idea of being outside of things, we are always influenced by what's going on in the present. And I think what's fascinating in your book is that part of your decision to reassess the Adams presidency, and I think part of your contribution, comes very much out of a recent event, January 6th. And this was fascinating to me because I know that from the cabinet, one of the things that you've really tried to drive home to people that I think is essential is just how fragile the presidency is. It is custom, it is tradition. And this gets into your argument about John Adams and appreciating him. So could you talk about John Adams' presidency and how the previous assessments of him may have been unfair and how January 6th gives us a new lens for appreciating what he did?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that question. I think history is so much about what questions we ask. That's how we write. That's what we know to write. That's how we know what to look for. And the product that you get depends on what questions you ask and what you were looking for in the archives. And that is often shaped by your own personal experiences, what you have lived through. And the end result can be really different depending on the question. And so that's why I think that revisiting subjects is really quite important, because if you have someone who's come from a very different lived experience, they're going to ask questions that might get at something in a new way. And for me, I had sort of a base understanding of John Adams' presidency. And as I was starting to think about this book in 2020, and I was thinking about how do I want to assess John Adams' cabinet, it was really inspired by trying to figure out how did the presidency work after Washington was my initial focus. And I was actually thinking about writing about Adams and Jefferson. And then I started writing and realized I didn't want to write the Jefferson part and dropped that off. But I knew that I wanted to write something about Adams, and I wasn't totally sure what the angle was. And then January 6th happened. And for someone who, you said since I wrote the cabinet, I've been talking about how fragile these things are. And yet even I really took for granted the peaceful transfer of power and was not thinking about how fragile it was, how much has to go into it by so many people to ensure that it works. And I started looking at the previous biographies of Adams and had already sort of made the argument that they gave his presidency relatively short shrift, because when you're doing a biography on a life as full as Adams, you have to leave things out. And I thought that maybe that was something that was worth not leaving out. But then I realized that none of those authors had lived through January 6th. And so none of them had seen what it looked like to have a violent transition. And so they were not going to ask the same questions. And then I started really digging into the materials and realized as I was looking through it just how many small actions over the course of his entire presidency Adams made and pursued and took carefully with intention to ensure the survival of institutions. And if you're not looking for them specifically, they're really easy to miss. And so I think that's generally why they're not appreciated, especially because a lot of them require things like restraint, which is not a very sexy concept. It's not like winning a civil war or, winning World War II or something, but it's so essential in times of crisis. And so I wanted to bring out all of those decisions, all of those moments that ensured that these things did survive past 1800.
The title, I don't know if we've said the actual title, but Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. When we think about, you're talking about all these precedents that Adams put in motion, we think of precedents being set by George Washington, of course. And so here, Adams, he's elected president, and he has to set the precedent or navigate the first presidential transition. So talk about what was going on in his mind, always conscious of the man who preceded him and always in his shadow. What was John Adams' perspective and goals as he approached, forming a cabinet and forming his own agenda?
It's a great question. And you're right. We do typically associate the precedents with Washington. And what I kind of wanted to do with this book was just sort of flip it on its head and say he certainly established a model, but precedents require repetition over time. And they often require repetition over many decades and even centuries to gain the sort of entrenched, powerful nature that we're used to. And so that has to start with the person who repeats them the first time, and that is Adams. And that gets at the nature of the complexity of his situation, because he only had that one model to follow, and it was Washington's. And if he followed Washington's model, he knew that he was going to fall short in the estimation of the American people. Like, no one wants to be compared to Washington. That was just going to suck. So he knew that. But he also knew that if he diverged from Washington's model, then he was going to be criticized for it, because people were going to say, like, oh, you think you know better than Washington. And so it was really a lose-lose situation. And he knew that. And yet he did it anyway. And so I think that moment is really the fact that he shows up and he does this and he's willing to take it on as a moment of political courage. But that entire question of like how to find that middle ground between not appearing to be rebuking Washington's suggestion, but trying to put a little bit of his own stamp on it, completely defines his approach as he enters the administration. And the cabinet is a great example of that, because he had never been in a single cabinet meeting. Washington did not invite him to one. He didn't really know how the executive branch actually worked. He had never had executive experience.
God bless him.
Lindsay, if I could just
Yeah.
respectfully interrupt for a second, because we're all shaking our heads here.
Yeah.
Because then people can't see our expressions, but this is one of the things that stands out as you get into this book is that, we love Washington, right? We're programmed where we've learned there's so many reasons to love Washington, but there's a lot of disappointment in Washington as you read this book, and that's credit to the author to not fall in love with the period in which you write and you study. So just real quick, you said this, Adams was never in a cabinet meeting. So just a little bit as you describe the transition about the relationship between Washington and Adams.
Yeah. And so this is where I think an important distinction is worth making. So at that point, the vice president actually sat in on as Adams assumed the role. And again, if you look at the Constitution and you look at Article 2, which defines the executive branch, the vice president has like one sentence.
Yes, we covered this last week with Nicole Hemmer. There's just he's a cast, he breaks ties. And that's why it's so hard. It's so hard to figure out who's good or bad at it.
Totally. And so like what the vice president was supposed to do, Adams was kind of like, well, I don't know. Okay, I guess I'll go sit in the Senate every day. So he did. So on one hand, it is possible that Washington really thought of the vice president as really being more in the legislative branch. Not totally sure I buy that argument, but that is an argument that has been made. So I think it is possible to say, okay, so if that person was actually in the legislative branch, then maybe they shouldn't be a part of cabinet meetings. Two, I think, important things to think about that. I think the much more compelling reason that Washington did not have Adams in cabinet meetings was because he just didn't really trust his political judgment. They were respectful of one another. They respected their service. They respected their contribution to the nation, but they weren't close. They were about as different as two white dudes in the 1790s could be personality-wise. And Adams had criticized some of Washington's choices during the Revolution. Washington had a memory like an elephant. He did not forget these things. Adams was always a little bit jealous of the fact that Washington's service was so much more celebrated than his service as a diplomat. There's also I think he was probably a little bit jealous of like this stature question. Like when Washington walked into the room, people took note. That was not always the case with Adams. And so they just didn't necessarily click. And then in the first year of Washington's presidency, Adams took a fairly unpopular position on what the president should be called. He wanted a very ostentatious title. And the Congress ended up rejecting that. And it turns out Washington probably didn't want that either. And it was a very unpopular thing. And Adams was dubbed his rotundity and the dangerous vice in response to this crisis. And so I think that was when we really start to see a distance between the two of them. So all of that makes sense. Okay, so he doesn't really trust Adams. He doesn't really want him in the cabinet for whatever reason. He still could have told Adams how the cabinet worked. And he still could have told Adams that a couple of his secretaries in particular were not up to the demands of the job. So this is where I actually really fault him. I don't really necessarily even fault him for the cabinet, like not including him in the cabinet part. But Washington was so meticulous about making sure the first election occurred in like a regular way. He wanted there to be a clear transition. He wanted to make sure it didn't happen when he died. He wanted to make sure he was present to give his stamp of approval and authority. He attended the inauguration. He did all of these things so carefully. And then he did not tell Adams that his Secretary of War, James McHenry, was bad at his job, and that the Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, had been his sixth choice and was not well suited to a position of diplomacy and probably shouldn't be in that position. And I don't know why, because he often didn't write down what he was thinking, which is very annoying. But my best guess is that he wasn't sure what Adams was going to do as president. And the best way he could ensure his diplomacy, his foreign policy, his various, administrative agenda was continued was to encourage the secretaries to stay in office. And there was no model of secretaries resigning or retiring or, giving their sort of pro forma resignation like there is today. So Adams thinking, well, I know how hard it was for Washington to get people in these positions. They were not as prestigious as they are today. He knew that. He knew that Washington had trouble, and if Washington had trouble, he would certainly have trouble. He had no reason to think that the cabinet secretaries were bad, because if they were bad, he thought Washington would get rid of them. And there was not the precedent that there is today that like you do not keep your predecessor's cabinet. Rule number one of presidential administrationing is do not keep your predecessor's cabinet. So he didn't know that. And so he kept them. And what's unfortunate is if Washington and Adams had actually had a conversation, especially on foreign policy, they were so closely aligned. And I think he would have given Washington great comfort.
Yeah. And this is what's fascinating here, too, is like you don't have this precedent. Washington has so much to manage. And you're now dealing with the fact that you have cabinet secretaries that have more connections and more power than John Adams has. And the story of Timothy Pickering, like the way this guy just is like, no, I do foreign policy, and how Adams has to fight to get information from Pickering. And Pickering, in the meantime, is like negotiating with like, you know, in the 1790s, he's negotiating with like Alexander Hamilton, who's just been like appointed the head of the army, and Francisco de Miranda in South America and the British. And Adams is like, what are you guys doing? And Pickering's like, shut up, don't worry about it. This is like where you have this this great quote here that I thought it was brilliant. You say, Adams was protective of executive power, but not often precious about his own. And you really see that there where he's just like, maybe we agree, maybe we don't agree, but you can't just keep information from me in Congress. And Pickering just fights him on it.
One of my favorite things about talking to people about this book as I've started to have these conversations is how much I've made everyone hate Timothy Pickering.
Yeah. He's a jerk.
Did you make or did you just lay it out? I mean,
well, I will admit that I usually, when I'm writing, I try really hard to not let my personal feelings about someone come through all the way because I want people to be able to make up their own minds. I may have not done that with Pickering.
Well, you know, what it gets into, and Lindsay, this is, all right, I'm going to dive into this because this was fascinating to me. You know, if we go back, let's say 10 years, right? And we go, what have we learned about history, right? And you can thank Lin-Manuel Miranda for this. It's like recovering Hamilton, right? Because Hamilton was when I was in undergraduate, Hamilton was the bad guy in the story, right? Yeah. And and Adams and Jefferson conspire to destroy his reputation. And then that's fair, right? Because we missed out on some of his appointments. This book, honestly, as I'm reading it, it does for Adams a lot of what we got from, we got to give credit for Chernow for writing that book, which I had read before, that recovers Hamilton. You do a lot of this for Adams, and you make the point that like Hamilton really is an a-hole when it comes to dealing with Adams, and he helps with him and Jefferson conspire to destroy Adams' reputation as president, and we believe that.
We totally do. It's one of the things that kind of blows my mind is if you look at a lot of historians' descriptions of Adams, they're often direct quotes from Hamilton or Jefferson, and I'm like, but guys, like, you don't trust them on anything else. Like, why are you trusting them on this? Like, usually when people are taking, when they're assessing what Hamilton's words or Jefferson's words, they're taking it with a grain of salt, as they should. These are often very partisan documents. They are written with a partisan goal in mind. And so they're useful, but they have to be analyzed. And yet when it comes to Adams, they don't do that. And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense to me.
There's so many ways to go here. I mean, I am really, I don't know what to say first, but I guess to follow along. So there's this transition, and Adams keeps on Washington's cabinet, which we've established wasn't the A team.
No.
And it wasn't the B team probably, right?
No, because the B team had already said no. This was like the A, B, C, D, E, the G team.
So you got Pickering, Secretary of State, and you have McHenry, and you have Walcott, and these guys are part of the Essex Junto. Tell our listeners, who were the Essex Junto?
The thing is just like history is so interesting if you just like tell the stories. Like you can't make this stuff up. And so John Hancock dubbed this group of sort of most radical Federalists. And he actually dubbed them this during the Revolution. They're a group of men who were all born in Essex County, Massachusetts. And then they spread out from there. And they didn't all stay in Massachusetts. And then they also had allies like Oliver Wolcott Jr., who was from Connecticut, and Alexander Hamilton, who was in New York. But they were the most extreme wing of the Federalist Party. And they typically were the most pro-war voices. They hated France. They were very distrusting of immigrants, lots of xenophobia. They were the most ardent supporters of the Alien and Sedition Act. So like all of kind of the worst impulses of the time, they were the most vocal supporters of them.
That group of people, can we say the Northern Confederacy?
They do talk about seceding at some point.
Yeah, they certainly become that. They certainly become that. Most of them were also involved in the secession efforts during the War of 1812. So they certainly become the Northern Confederacy. Yes. I mean, it's just, yeah.
Can I just say, and I'll get off this quick, but if you follow the Essex Junto and the region they come from, and you look at their descendants in they become the know-nothings. Like there are, what I'm trying to say is the elements in this book, in your book, there's the nullification, there's the Essex, this xenophobic thread, there is the beginnings of this north-south thing going on. It all continues to be relevant for the next 50 to the Civil War. Yeah. If not beyond. And that's what that's the only point I'm trying to make here as you pick this up, is that I want the listeners to understand that this time, the Adams administration, as told by you, is so relevant for everything that comes after. And everything that comes after is impacted by this time period.
It is. And I mean, at the very starting point, Jefferson would not have won in 1800 for not the 3/5 clause. And that's like, people always say, like, what is the biggest factor in Adams' loss? I'm like, well, the Constitution. The Constitution is the biggest factor. But picking up on the Essex Junto, so not only was it like this cabal of people who were in communication, but many of the members of the cabinet were very involved. So Timothy Pickering was one of the original members of the Essex Junto. James McHenry was a very loyal ally. Oliver Wolcott Jr. was part of like sort of the Confederate aristocracy, and they were all very interconnected. And so they would write, like Timothy Pickering and Oliver Wolcott would write to the members in Massachusetts and explain to them what was happening. And when Adams would go back to Quincy to be at home during the summer or for a visit, the other members who had been friends with him, had friends with Adams, had known Adams for decades, many of them had served at the local level together, would come and would try and get him to do the things that Pickering and McHenry wanted him to do. And they were often in cahoots behind the scenes. And if Adams didn't agree, then they would work to try and scuttle whatever it was that he was doing. And for example, the most petty moment that demonstrates how they did this occurred in the fall of 1799, after Adams' peace commission, his second peace commission, went to France to try and solve what was called the Quasi-War. And the Essex Junto loathed this peace commission because it was going to take away their beloved army. And they convinced the governor of Massachusetts to take out a message or take out a sentence from his Thanksgiving message, hoping for peace, like in diplomacy, and, asking for blessings on behalf of this diplomatic mission and the president. So it was not mentioned in the Thanksgiving address. And it is just the height of pettiness and smallness.
You get back into this, it's fascinating. You talk about, the Constitution, like we revere it today, even if we don't read it. We revere it. You said the Constitution, people care. Back then they didn't. Back then they're still like, is this going to hold together? And you have this odd approach by the Federalists, which is we're the best people. We need to be deciding what happens. And the best way to do that is we control the executive. Let's establish the executive. And they begin doing things that even I think 15, 20 years ago in America would have been nuts. Like, for example, advocating for a standing army, which most Americans, and Adams sees this, most Americans see as a threat, especially you got a tax for it. It's fascinating to me that you said that even Adams himself is feeling the pressure of the taxes that they're passing because he's like on a budget. We forget that we always go, oh, these rich white guys. Yeah, but like not all of them.
Not a hugely wealthy man. He's not Washington. He's not Jefferson.
Well, even Washington and Jefferson were like, it's cash strapped. You know what I'm saying? They had their investments in human labor or human chattel slavery, which was not an easy way to liquidate their funds. But, Adams is trying to put together a budget, and Abigail's like, these taxes are killing us. And to me, it's fascinating how quickly you see that turn Hamilton's advocating for a 50,000-man army. Could you talk about how Adams navigates this? Because it's an odd place to be, to see himself as the executive being marginalized, while at the same time, the office of the executive and its military power is being advocated. Others are advocating for its increase in power at the same time.
Yeah, so a little bit of background context, which is important to explain Adams' role. He had really wanted to appoint anyone else as the number 2 in the army. He had asked George Washington to come back to be the commander-in-chief. Washington had said yes, because you had to the problem with Washington is that while he was alive, if you were going to have a national crisis, he had to be involved because he was such a unifying figure. And unlike no other president in their post-presidential life. So this problem is a unique problem only to Adams. So he asked Washington to come back. Washington said yes, but said that he would only join the army if France actually invaded. And otherwise, he wanted to stay in Mount Vernon. So that meant that whoever was number 2 was going to have all the day-to-day executive power in terms of managing the army. And so Adams basically said, anyone but Hamilton. And Essex Junto and his cabinet said it must be Hamilton. And they basically pushed Washington into cornering Adams, and Washington threatened to resign if it wasn't Hamilton, and Adams had to back down. There was nothing he could do. Now, I think Washington allowed himself to be pushed into that corner, but nonetheless, they were very much manipulating the communications to make it seem as though Washington had to do that. So here's this army. Adams does not like the governing structure. He doesn't trust the governing structure, and the army is overtly and intentionally political. It's being staffed like a spoil system for the extreme Federalists. They're talking about using it domestically to crush political enemies and to march through the South to go seize Florida and New Orleans. So when I say that Adams was trying to undermine the army, to us today, that would sound terrible. But this is not an army we would like. This is not an army that we are comfortable with.
This is the type of army that you read about forms 2 years before there's a coup, where there's now a military dictatorship government.
100%. This is a very dangerous force. So Adams was kind of stuck in this situation, and he couldn't turn against the army because that would appear to be unpatriotic and potentially foolish if there did end up being a war with France, but he just didn't trust it. And he also had the sense that it didn't make sense for France to go to war with the United States. They really desperately needed trade with the U.S. That's how they supplied food for their colonies in the Caribbean. They didn't want to push the United States into the arms of the British. They were already fighting a war against the British. So how would they get an army anyway? Even though it was Napoleon, still you can only have so many people and so many ships, and the Atlantic Ocean is pretty big. So he basically said, I really don't think there's going to be this war. I'm going to pursue diplomacy. I'm going to continue to strengthen the Navy. John Adams loved the Navy. He was a good New Englander, understood where the timber comes from and the ships come from and the sailors come from and the trade come from. But also it made good sense. It helped the American economy. It protected trade. And if there was a war, Navy is your first line of defense, and it makes diplomacy better because it's the stick that you need in the carrot and stick situation. So continued to boost the Navy, and then did everything in his power to basically slow roll the army, to make sure that the expansion of it went as slowly as possible, to hinder any attempts to fill out the ranks, to stymie James McHenry's efforts to actually build this thing. And he did it in a very sneaky, subtle way, such that no one could ever blame him for it per se. But if you look at the records, it's very clear that he's doing it because he has totally different practices for how he communicates with James McHenry, the Secretary of War, and Benjamin Stoddert, the Secretary of the Navy. And one is designed to procrastinate, and one is designed to, expedite the expansion of the Navy. And at one point, McHenry says something, and Adams basically said, "Don't make me choose. I'm very clear about which is my favorite. Don't make me choose," which presidents probably shouldn't do generally, but I also totally understand in this situation.
Nixon meddles in the Vietnam War peace negotiations. It's not 100%, but it's pretty well documented that the Reagan campaign meddled in the release of the American hostages in Iran. Former President Trump recently meddled in the negotiations over peace between Israel and Gaza and the Hamas.
And he potentially tried to meddle in the hostage negotiations with Russia, which thankfully did not work, and we were able to get people out.
And now we know from your book that Thomas Jefferson was meddling with France during the negotiations to prevent a war with France.
While not just being a presidential candidate, but while being the vice president.
Right. I mean, and I think you say at one point that he was committing treason.
It was very close to treason. So technically, the legal definition of treason requires there to be a declaration of war. And we
That's
were
how
not
Burr got off.
technically. Yes, exactly. Those legal technicalities really come back to bite you sometimes. So technically, we were not at war with France. There was not a declared war. And so technically, it was not treason. But it's certainly a very bad look and deeply unpatriotic and a pretty crap thing to do as a vice president.
Maybe we could, to quote Arrested Development, say it was light treason.
It was light treason. That should really be a category under the Constitution, don't you think?
Yes.
So, before the inauguration, Jefferson and Adams have this moment, and it looks good. It looks like they're going to be a unified, it's kind of like they're back together again,
Yeah.
From it's like the old days. We're getting the band back together from Philly in 1776. But it doesn't quite turn out that way. And it doesn't turn out that way because Madison stops it from happening. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah. So they had both sort of made overtures during the transition period when it wasn't clear before the election results were announced and it wasn't clear who was going to win. They had both sort of reached out to the other because at this point they were not campaigning for president. The 18th century political custom required that presidential candidates not participate and their supporters really do the campaigning on their behalf. And at least in 1796, both Jefferson and Adams adhered to that very closely. So their supporters had been saying really nasty things about each other, but they had not. And so they both reached out to try and, sort of smooth the way. And then when they got to Philadelphia, they both visited one another. They had good conversations. And it looked for a moment like there might maybe be what we would think of as sort of a bipartisan administration. A couple of things stopped that from happening. Madison did not trust that this good feeling was going to last forever. And so he prevented or asked Jefferson not to send a letter that would have gone even further and in extending the goodwill and demonstrating that he wanted to work with Adams, because Madison felt like if that letter was ever made public and at this point Jefferson and Adams had separated, then that would be very embarrassing. He also really encouraged Jefferson not to trust Adams. So there was a lot of, I think, sort of behind the scenes emotional manipulation that Madison was doing, saying this person is not to be trusted. And then when the second part happened, when things occurred that Jefferson didn't necessarily agree with, rather than talking to Adams about it, rather than having a conversation, he immediately turned to Madison because he had been primed not to trust Adams and really turned towards the more radical Republicans. And so those two things combined to when it looked like, things with France were going to heat up and there was going to be more conflict, that was one of the real areas where they disagreed, where Jefferson was much more trusting of France and Adams was a little bit less trusting, but they actually both agreed that war was a really bad idea and probably could have come to a little bit of middle ground if they had had a conversation. But at that point, Jefferson had really turned away from Adams and Adams stopped making overtures. So it's not totally Jefferson's fault, but I do think it's more his fault than Adams.
If Washington would have had a few conversations with Adams, if Jefferson would have had a few conversations with Adams, you said the word earlier that I said in my head, repeated 100 times reading this book, petty.
Mm-hmm.
These people were petty.
And you know what? This brings up, Bob and Lindsay, I think one of the great discoveries from your book that you really didn't highlight that we should all know, which is, guys, we got to communicate with each other. All right?
Yeah.
We got to talk to each other. Communication is key. There we go. That's your lesson for the day.
It's true. Well, and sometimes they can be forgiven because communication could be very slow and very hard. But when they're in the same city and they live like 2 blocks from one another, there are fewer excuses.
So this brings us to this, because this is one of kind of the funny moments of the Adams administration is, for the first beginning of the federal government, it meets in New York on Wall Street, then it moves to Philadelphia. And then while Adams is the president, people finally move to Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. is just basically a swamp where like where you've got like L'Enfant laid out the plans, and then people built houses, places. He bulldozed them. They fired him, and they finally pieced together the executive mansion, which is going to be the White House. And Adams is the first to move into it midway through his presidency. It has a second floor, but not a staircase, I believe.
A very rudimentary one. They mostly actually lived on the second floor because the rooms were smaller and easier to heat. And one of the big challenges with Washington, D.C. at that time was it was surrounded by trees. There were forests everywhere, but there weren't enough people. And so trying to actually get firewood was really, really hard. So heating the rooms was a challenge. And most of the walls, the paint was still drying and the plaster was still drying. So you had to have fires going constantly in order to actually like dry this stuff and it doesn't turn into mold. And so they tried to like limit themselves to just a couple of rooms to reduce the fuel needs.
So he moves in, what is it? Is it 1799 that he moves in, or 1800? Like
November 1st, 1800 is the first night that he spends in the White House.
Yeah, and he's only going to be there.
Mansion.
He's only going to be there for a couple of months. And it's like, you're moving there, and moving is the worst thing on earth. But when you have cars and U-Hauls, this guy moves in there. And could you just talk about like what it's like when the government transitions to Washington, D.C.? Because I don't think people realize what kind of it's built out of nothing.
It really is. Yeah. So the area that Washington, D.C. was basically farmland. It was private farmland. There were lots of private homes. Georgetown was a little town and there was a pretty good port there. And Alexandria was actually across the river, was quite a large port. And at this point, Alexandria is technically considered to be part of Washington, D.C. because the original agreement called for there to be land from Maryland and land from Virginia. Eventually, the land from Virginia was given back. So Alexandria is part of this. It is a very bustling port, but where the executive mansion is, where the U.S. Capitol is, that was land that was all previously owned farmland. The roads were built out of nothing. There were still tree stumps and in some places very stubborn farmers who were planting corn in Pennsylvania Avenue. So this was like a very rudimentary space. And on her way into town, when Abigail came at the end of November, she actually got lost in the forest. And so like at one point it was like wandering and just was found by someone, thankfully, and gave her the right direction. So this was
you thought traffic was bad in D.C. If you thought traffic was bad, it's nothing compared to getting lost in the woods.
It's true. Although sometimes there are days when I would rather do the woods than the traffic because it's pretty awful. And then there were clusters of buildings around these places. So there were clusters of row homes, or what we would think of as townhouses, on Pennsylvania Avenue that eventually when the cabinet secretaries moved to Washington, D.C. in June of 1800, and they packed up all of their papers in crates, and most of them came down on ships and then were unloaded. So, this was like a months-long process. So basically the government was like on hiatus for like a couple of months. And they took up lodgings at a hotel, which was just across the street from the U.S. Capitol, which was very much under construction. And then they rented a series of townhomes on Pennsylvania Avenue next to each other, actually to be the government department offices while their buildings were still under construction. So the entire town was very much still in progress and was not a destination.
I don't want this conversation to end without talking about the Alien Sedition Acts and the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions.
Yes, two very essential parts of this period of time. And I think what sometimes people know best about the Adams administration, but I think sometimes the message they take away from it is maybe not the complete message. So in response to the threat of war in 1798, Congress passed lots of legislation. They greatly expanded the size of the Army. They created the Navy and the Naval Department for the first time. So that was when Adams finally gets a naval secretary. They increased spending for coastal defenses in preparation. And then they passed 4 bills that are called the Alien Sedition Acts, but there are actually 4 of them. There was a naturalization bill, which made it much harder to become a citizen because immigrants tended to vote for Democratic Republicans, or Republicans as they called themselves. We didn't really talk about this, but the Democratic Republicans, or the Jeffersonian Republicans, most historians use those terms because they don't want people to confuse the Republican Party of the 1790s with the Republican Party of Lincoln or the Republican Party today. But they use the word Republican. So just for clarity. So there's the naturalization bill. There was the Alien Enemy Act, which said that in times of war, if there was a declared war, then the president has the right to invoke a deportation process of foreign nationals living on U.S. soil. But that went through the regular channels of due process.
Mass deportations.
Well, this one isn't quite the mass deportations. This one is like sort of the regular process of like, if you have declared war against Germany and there are people who are German nationals who have not like become American citizens and they might be you don't trust them, then you start the legal process. But it's much more through like the appropriate justice channels. And actually, we have had a bill like that on the books since then, and it has been invoked in times of war. And that bill was actually put forth by the Republicans who were trying to stave off the much more radical Alien Friends Act, which is sort of the concept of mass deportations, which was that the president would have the right to deport a foreign national, even if at times of peace, without that due process. So the president was sort of...
When was that?
These were all passed in the summer of 1798.
Okay, cool.
And what's critical to know about all of these bills is that Adams asked for none of them. He did nothing to curry support for them. He did not whip votes. He did not do anything like that. He did sign them. Critically, the Alien Friends Act, which gave him sole power to be judge, jury, and executioner, essentially, he never invoked. So not a single person was deported. So while the bill itself is deplorable, it was never actually put into practice. The last bill is the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the president and Congress, and notably left out the vice president, or to encourage people to obstruct any active government. So basically suppressed.
To speak, print, say, utter, or to encourage others to utter. It is so vague. It's so broad.
Yes, it is incredibly vague. And it allowed for truth to be a defense, which truth is often a defense to libel or slander. But how do you prove the veracity of a political opinion? Like, it can't be done. And so the bill,
People are trying to do it every day, but yes, it is impossible. There's a whole industry out there.
That is true. That is true. In the legal system, it's very hard to do that, which I think people are finding out. So again, Adams didn't ask for the bill. He didn't try and get the bill passed, but he did sign it. And while he was not responsible for starting the prosecutions, he did approve of some of them. And Timothy Pickering, our old friend, was the most ardent supporter of the Sedition Act and was the one in charge of getting the prosecutions going. So I think he deserves more of the blame, but it is certainly a black mark on the Adams administration, and it is a bill that we would consider to be wildly unconstitutional today.
And you point out here that one of Adams' great contributions is that he's able to kind of sate his party's desire for this legislation while at the same time not necessarily enforcing it here. And this is one of those cases where, like, this is fascinating, right? Because they give him this power and he doesn't evoke it. And to me, that's like, that follows the pattern that you say, right? He appeases these folks while doing the right thing. But it seems like in this case, just simply being associated with it is enough to destroy his reputation. So do you think this was a miscalculation? Do you think he should have pushed back harder in retrospect?
I think he probably should. I mean, he did approve of some of the prosecutions. And I think the context is really important here because today we have jurisprudence that says you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. You cannot use language that is designed to, or rather, you are not protected from using language that is designed to provoke violence. That is not protected under the First Amendment. They didn't have any of those protections at the time. And so people were encouraging violence in the newspapers, and there was political violence on the streets. And so I think the problem with the sedition bill is that, like, the fear that generated the bill was actually completely understandable and I think in good faith, but what they did to respond to it was wildly inappropriate. And so they just went way too far. And Adams got a little wrapped up in that enthusiasm as well. And so I think that's where he deserves, a little bit of the criticism. And the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were in response to these bills. The Kentucky resolution was drafted by Jefferson. The Virginia resolution was drafted by Madison. Jefferson's drafts were much more radical. Madison's were much more moderate. And what we understand as the principle of nullification, Madison had not included in his draft for Virginia. Without asking him, Jefferson had one of their allies insert that language into the draft, and it was then leaked to the newspapers. And so then it was, all over the country, and people were talking about this principle of nullification. And it didn't pass with that language. And so Madison got them to remove it. And then the more moderate version was passed, but the damage was done because people already thought that this thing said that the states had the right to nullify national legislation. So there was a lot of backlash to that because that was seen to be a way too radical response to these bills. Like, there are ways that you can counter these bills that are not blowing up the nation. But I think it does get at the pervasive sense that many of the people had, which was that like any one misstep was going to doom the country. Like, they genuinely felt like they were teetering on the edge. And I don't really blame them because it was a new thing. It's very easy to tear down new things. And the Constitution was already their second chance. And most nations don't get second chances. So they were just so nervous about it. The one other thing I think I should mention that a lot of people think, oh, well, Adams lost his reelection campaign because of the Alien and Sedition Acts. But the people at the time saw the Federalist agenda as the Alien and Sedition Acts plus the taxes that you guys mentioned, plus the Army. Like, they were all interwoven into one big package. They could not be separated. And Adams had a very keen understanding of how unpopular that was and worked pretty hard to try and mitigate it because he was traveling and seeing how people were responding and wasn't super wealthy, and so understood what it meant to have these taxes. And so I think that whole picture is really important.
How did the 1798 midterms go?
So the 1798 midterms were deceptive, and it's one of the reasons the Federalists continued with their very extreme programming, because most of the 1790 midterms occurred before a lot of the Alien and Sedition prosecutions were taking place. So the Federalists actually did incredibly well in the midterms because their warnings about France and the likelihood of war appeared to be prescient, and the Republicans appeared to be quite foolish for their warm embrace of France. So the Federalists did really well. They picked up a ton of states, including in places like North Carolina, which was typically a bed of Republican support. And it gave them very unwarranted confidence about how they would do in the next coming years.
I think there are some interesting parallels here, too. A party that's in power, seeing that its electoral margin is very slim, seeking to eliminate potential new voters, making it harder for them to do it, seeing the writing on the wall with Western expansion, the addition of Kentucky and Tennessee into... sometimes whenever you've got power right now and you see the writing on the wall, you might want to keep some people from voting or becoming citizens. Just saying, look into that. I guess the last thing I wanted to ask about, coming back to this theme of like Adams having his reputation destroyed, is this story of the midnight appointments, right? And how this is proof that Adams is petty and mean, and he just stays in there appointing all these to basically keep Federalist control, because to this point, in the election of 1800, the Federalists had controlled, if you count Washington, he wasn't one, but the Federalist opinions had controlled the entire federal government, right? Both houses of Congress, yeah. You've got the presidency and therefore the appointments. And the revolution of 1800, as Jefferson calls it, changes everything. And there's this image of Adams going, well, I'll get you, and appointing all these people. But you say that's completely unfair.
It is unfair. I do understand a little bit where Jefferson was coming from, because a lot of the entire judicial branch was basically Federalist at this point, because as you said, they were appointed by Washington and Adams. And even though Washington himself wasn't always an extreme Federalist, some of the justices did turn out to be quite extreme and had not comported themselves with what we would consider to be appropriate judicial temperament during the sedition trials. So they did sort of distrust some of the Federalist judges and justices. However, Washington had continued to fill appointments up until the day before his inauguration. So that was the expectation of what presidents do. And to be fair, their power they turn into a pumpkin on inauguration day. They don't turn into a pumpkin after the election. So the president is still the president until election day. Now we tend to see it as if there are vacancies in that period of time, typically we leave them open sort of out of deference to the person that is going to come next. But the only model,
but not always.
But not always.
In 2020.
Not always, and certainly not when it comes to the Supreme Court. So when Adams, so I should say, so the midnight appointments were these justices and judges that were created by this new Judiciary Act. Now, the first federal Congress created the judicial branch in the summer of 1789. The judicial branch is mentioned in the Constitution, but it does not specify how many tiers there are, how many justices there are, how it works. That was Congress's doing. Almost immediately, the justices of the Supreme Court said this system is stupid. It does not work. We have to ride circuit, which meant that they had to go ride around on horseback or in carriage to the various states to hold court in those places. It made no sense. The Americans have always been a very litigious people. They were quickly outstripping the court's ability to actually hear cases. So immediately, the Supreme Court started asking for another tier of courts, what we would think of as like the appellate courts. There were district courts and there was the Supreme Court. They wanted the appellate courts such that they did not have to ride circuit. The Attorney General immediately was asking for this. Washington was immediately suggesting it in his updates to Congress, which we would call the State of the Union today. Adams was asked for it from the beginning of his presidency. He had been pushing for it, and he had suggested that they bring forth a bill for every single term that he was in office, including earlier in 1800, and they hadn't done it. Once the Federalists finally saw the writing on the wall and realized that the Republicans were going to be taking over the presidency and were going to pick up huge margins in both houses of Congress, then they finally passed a judiciary reform bill. Two things about this bill that are important to know. One, it was a really good bill. It did all the things, all the reforms that everyone had been asking for, and it basically created the appellate system that we have today. Two, it was also very politically motivated. Both things can be true at once. So it was politically motivated because they understood that it would create way more federal judges, and it would deprive Jefferson of a Supreme Court seat because it reduced the size of the Supreme Court and basically said that when the next retirement happened, he wouldn't get an appointment. So it was politically motivated and a really good bill. Adams had been pushing for this bill, had been asking for this bill. When they finally signed it, he immediately sent in all the appointments, and they dawdled and they dawdled and they dawdled. So the Senate did not confirm all of the judges until a couple of weeks before the inauguration. Not the night before, a couple of weeks before. But it was not Adams' fault. It was the Senate's fault.
Aha, because the Senate has to approve all judicial appointments.
Senate has to approve all judicial appointments. And Senate passes the bill. So Senate passed the bill when it did. It was very slow to approve appointments. Jefferson is just a brilliant propagandist, and his language stuck.
Lindsay, I think we could talk to you for hours.
This book is so good, Lindsay.
It's so good.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much. You know, the best part about writing a book is sharing it with people, as you know. And so getting people who are like excited to talk to you about it is just way too much fun. It should not be called work.
We're very, very excited to talk about this book.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Right.
Thanks,
Bye,
guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to The Road to Now. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell the world by giving us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or 5 stars on Spotify. Or spread the word directly. Just text a friend maybe, or share a link on social media. Anything helps and we appreciate it. And if you've got a friend who hasn't gotten into podcasts yet, let them know they can hear us every weekend on SiriusXM's POTUS Channel 124. Now is the time when we say our special thanks to our supporters on Patreon and give a shout out to our Washingtonians. That list is Tanya Marsh, Mary Hawking, Tim and Caitlin Wells, Fig White, Matt Williams, Team Martin, Ann Williams and Frank Edwards, Nate Farrer, Jennifer and Magnolia, Chris and Teresa Adams, Joy Avery, Edward Carlson, and Aaron and Derek Garrison. Thanks to all you guys for supporting us. If you want to support our work and maybe get on that list, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/theroadtonow. You'll get extended versions of select conversations, extra episodes, bonus materials, and more. That's all available at patreon.com/theroadtonow. For more on the show, visit our website, theroadtonow.com, where you can easily search our back catalog and quickly find links to content. Why is it so good? 7 Ages Design. That's who made it. If you're looking for a website, go check them out. The Road to Now is hosted and produced by Bob Crawford and me, Ben Sawyer. Our associate producer is Gary Fletcher. This episode was edited by Ben Sawyer, and our theme music, like pretty much always, was by Paul DeFiglia. For Bob Crawford, this is Ben Sawyer. Thank you for listening. Take care.